This is going to sound like I'm starting completely off topic, but just let me explain. I first played Skyrim, well, it's difficult to ascertain. It was definitely long enough ago that I don't properly remember it, but it was also a substantial time after the game release, given back in the day I was a little behind the times when it came to game releases. And I remember finding it okay, I guess. It's possible I was just an idiot child with zero attention span, and in fact it's likely, but all I really remember is just going through the main quest line and then getting kind of bored. Which, if you've heard anything about Skyrim, it must sound like sacrilege, because, as you know, the main quest is generally considered to be one of the worst parts of the game. I'm not sure if my problems with the game are legitimate or not. I have my theories as to why it never held my interest, but I've never gone back to confirm them. But what I do know is that experience led me to not really be fond of open world design, or at least how it was being used in every single new game. It's because of that Breath of the Wild was not a game that I expected to enjoy. Like I said, at that point I wasn't very enthralled with open world experiences, and to be fair, I'm still not. Like, I recently played Horizon Zero Dawn, and despite its genuinely enthralling premise, it still had the same effect as Skyrim. Like, yeah, it's okay, it's fine. Played through it once, went through the main quest, and I'll never play it again. So, I didn't get Breath of the Wild when it released. Well, I mean, I also didn't own a Switch, but even if I did, I probably only would have bought it because it was one of the only, like, 3 games released for the fucking thing. And that is exactly what happened. I got a Switch a year later, and because there was still no games released for the thing, I got Breath of the Wild as a Christmas gift that year to make my hunk of plastic and silicon actually do something. And at this point, I hadn't seen any spoilers for the game, not from a concerted effort, but in spite of it. I'd seen all the positive impressions, but I figured it wasn't for me, so I didn't really bother looking into it, and I let all the finer details of the game pass me by. What I didn't expect, however, is that after playing it, it would almost immediately jump to being my second favourite game of all time. Breath of the Wild is actually fairly light on survivalist mechanics, with cooking and temperature really being the only two that fit that description, so why do I feel going out here is an effective visual allegory for the game? Well, it's because of atmosphere. Wandering a post-apocalypse is certainly not a new concept, and this certainly isn't a post-apocalypse, but Breath of the Wild's take on that idea is unique in just how relaxing it can be, while still maintaining the somber and melancholic tones that you'd expect. Wandering the vast expanses of Hyrule, there's an almost simple joy that comes along with it, just going off in whatever direction catches your attention, whatever landmark seems interesting, with nothing to guide you, nothing accompanying you, other than yourself, and nothing accentuates that feeling more than the mechanic of climbing. Which, when you analyse it, is kind of weird, in both how it's kind of not that good, but also a fundamental part of what makes the game so great. Like, the act of climbing isn't actually very mechanically interesting, nor is it ever expanded on past the plateau, but the fact that you can ascend any surface is why the game's exploration can work. By not locking you out of certain areas until you progress through the game, and instead just making that traversal easier as you gain more stamina and gear, you can never be explicitly limited from exploring any location. You are absolutely implicitly blocked from certain areas. The steep cliffs of the Gerudo Highlands and the Hebra Mountains are two pretty obvious examples that are very difficult to traverse in the early game, both because of their hilly landscapes and also the extreme cold and snowfall. The thing is though, there's nothing stopping you from launching yourself into these locations early in the game. It's much more difficult, but you can survive. By removing the reins from the player so explicitly, the designers can allow the world itself to take focus. It's why the lack of traditional open-world design elements, at least in the way that they're usually used, like waypoint markers or compass arrows or visual trails, is so vitally important. It places focus on the actual exploration of the wild, and if your progress was limited in the way that the climbing system avoids, you'd be too focused on where you should be going rather than where you want to go. It's what makes it so relaxing. When you combine the somber music choices, the beautiful but still easy to pass and also render visual style, with this gameplay that places focus on your own sense of exploration. Not guiding you into certain places where they want you to go, but rather by using its open systems, like climbing, to guide you to explore the open world simply for the sake of exploring it. Breath of the Wild is one of the only open world games I've seen where it feels like the fact that it's an open world was a core part of the design, that it uses that fact to build its fundamental design philosophies. It's not a game where you do stuff in an open world, it's a game specifically about that open world. It's a game that's more often than not interested in the stuff you do between quests than those quests themselves. It's clearly where most of the design attention was put if you watch any of the developer talks. A lot of analysis of Breath of the Wild focuses on stuff like the divine beast, the shrines, the more specific elements, and while that's not an incorrect lens to analyse the game through, in fact when you're doing a review, retrospective, whatever, it's kind of the only way that makes sense, but it also does seem, at least to me, to be counter to what I actually see from the game. Because what I found is that stuff isn't the goal, and like on a surface level that seems obvious, a lot of people have said similar things, but what I mean by that specifically is that all the quest stuff, shrines and divine beasts most of all, is never the stuff the designers want you to do. Your goal is never to complete X number of shrines, or conquer the divine beasts, or even to destroy Ganon. What those are is direction. They're instead used to give a destination for your journey. There's an old adage that the journey is more important than the destination, and Breath of the Wild is a clear example of that, but it's also an example that there is no journey without a destination. You have to be going somewhere, even if getting there is less important than everything that came before. To me, that was the purpose of all of those elements. It was never a reward, just a tool to push you in a direction. Does that excuse them for not being to as high a standard as they could have? For my own personal enjoyment, yeah, actually, but in the more broad context of the game's overall quality, no, of course not. But that's why being able to climb anywhere is so important. It's not about being able to complete objectives in any order, it's not even about being non-linear, it's about making the exploration between locations more inviting, to not, after so clearly telling you to go off and explore, to then turn around and physically block you from exploring. Because right, exploring is what the designers want you to do, so it's what they tell you to do through the design. They make it so clearly obvious that exploring is what you should go out and do, that even if you just normally go and do the main quest and ignore everything else, you still feel compelled to engage with the game in the best possible way. There's a lot of discussion, especially surrounding this game, about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. The idea that players can either be motivated internally by a desire to seek out and conquer challenges for their own personal satisfaction, or externally by gaining progression and rewards for their effort. And it usually boils down to the fact that Breath of the Wild's intrinsically motivated elements are better than its extrinsic ones, that the exploration is more polished than the quests, and that you'll enjoy the game more if you're more of an intrinsically motivated player. And while that isn't wrong, I think there is a crucial factor that's missing from that observation. That being how well the game pushes you towards its more intrinsically motivated elements. The game actively incentivizes you to play the game in a way that makes you engage with its less extrinsic elements. It's so effective that me, someone who's fairly extrinsically motivated, as my failed attempts at speedrunning can attest, ignored the main quest for much of my first playthrough, which, if you remember my Skyrim anecdote from the beginning, isn't something I would normally do. The way the objectives are structured to disincentivize completing them in a specific order, the way the map is designed to landmark interesting locations rather than important ones, the vast amount of space between major locations, it directs your focus away from the main quest and towards the exploration the game wants you to engage with. It's how it gets away with being hyper-focused on its player-driven gameplay, where I find so many other games struggle. It pushes you to engage with it in a way that it benefits most from, which is what makes the relaxing experience of exploration work so well. Without it, climbing towers, defeating enemy camps, locating shrines, all of the stuff that is typically just in between gameplay, padding, they'd be just that. It'd be padding to artificially increase your time with the game. But by shifting your focus so that you now seek them out for the joy of exploration, the designers have flipped that on its head and have made the gameplay I'd normally ignore, and also conversely the most polished experience of the game, something that I'd actively seek out. Why go off exploring, wandering into the wild with no promise of a reward when there's a main quest line that promises much more definitive rewards and fulfillment? Well, why should I go off exploring, wandering into the wild with no promise of a reward when there's a number of other things I could be doing that promise much more definitive fulfillment? Well, Breath of the Wild decided to answer that question by creating a relaxing ambience for you to engage with, and then expertly directing your attention so that you engage with that experience for your own enjoyment, for the same reason that I enjoy being out here. Being out here, either by yourself or with those you care about, it's relaxing, it's fun, and it can be somber and melancholic in its serenity, just like Breath of the Wild. I think that's the feeling that I enjoy so much about both of these experiences. It's a form of escape really, a chance to explore simply for the sake of exploring, to truly be alone with yourself and with your own thoughts, to wander across a beautiful landscape, soaking in the relaxing ambience. It's an experience that is very special. Games can capture a wide variety of emotions, excitement, fear, passion, intrigue, introspection, but the way that Breath of the Wild captures the simple joy of exploring the wild is what makes it so beautiful.